and welcome to the Mbm Podcast, where you'll learn to master the business of yoga. Mbm is a proud part of the Wander Barn Podcast Network, and I'm your host, Amanda Kingsmith. I'm a 500-hour registered yoga teacher, a yoga business coach, and a total business geek. Here at Mbm, you'll learn everything you need to know to create a sustainable yoga business by learning from myself and guests from around the world about how they built their yoga businesses, and about how you too can become a successful yoga teacher, studio owner, and much more. All right, let's dive in. Hello, friends, and welcome back for another episode of the Mbm Podcast. I am so grateful that you've decided to join me for this final episode of 2020. This episode of the podcast is brought to you in partnership with Offering Tree. Offering Tree makes digital marketing fun, easy, and affordable. They are your one-stop shop for your website, scheduling software, membership management, payment, email newsletter, and more. Keep listening to hear how you can use Offering Tree to spend more time teaching and less time managing. And when I say that, I really mean it. I have been working with Offering Tree for a long time now, and I love their products and services. And I've talked to so many yoga teachers who are using Offering Tree, and it's made everything so much more simple for them. So make sure you go check them out, and we'll talk a little bit more about them as we go through this episode. So stay tuned for that. Now, today on the podcast, I am doing my annual year in review. So we're talking all about 2020. And I'm not going to lie, when I thought about doing this episode, I really strongly considered just not doing a 2020 year in review, because we all know it's been a bit of a year. And quite honestly, I'm not sure if we need to revisit a lot of the things from 2020. However, I really do believe that so much growth and development happens from doing a year in review and from looking back and reflecting on the last year. And you, the listener of this show, are such a big part of me and my business and everything that goes on. So I want to let you in on the personal side of what's been going on for me over the last year, talk a little bit about what's been going on with Mbm, and so much more. So let's dive into all things 2020. All right, so I kicked off 2020 in Panama City, Panama. That is where I started the year, and I had another chill New Year's Eve with my husband. We watched fireworks from gigantic windows in our Panama City apartment, and then we were also able to run across the hall to the gym that also has a patio and look at the fireworks from there. So we didn't even have to leave our apartment to get a really amazing show. And Panama City is actually known for its fireworks. So that was pretty cool. In early February, we took a local trip to a beautiful little city in interior Panama called Boquete, and we had an amazing trip. It was a beautiful weekend-long trip that we did some nature stuff, some waterfall visits, some hiking, all that goodness. And in the middle of February, I turned 31, so I celebrated my 31st birthday in Panama. And then within a couple of days of that, headed down to Colombia to celebrate Carnival in Barranquilla. And this was a really amazing week. So if anyone can remember back to early 2020, at this point, we were hearing about coronavirus because it was already happening in Asia. Many of the countries in Asia were already in quarantines and lockdowns. And so traveling to Colombia had both my husband and I a little aware and on edge because cases were starting to pop up all over the world. People were starting to talk about it a little bit more. And we were going to one of the biggest festivals around the world. And Barranquilla is known for their Carnival in Colombia. It's like the place to go for Carnival. Yet everything was fine. There were no confirmed cases. We met up with some friends there. We had a really amazing time celebrating Carnival. And then we headed to Santa Marta, which is also in Colombia, for a couple of days. Now, Santa Marta was a pretty cool experience because this is actually one of the first places that my husband and I visited when we were in Colombia back in 2014. So if you know a bit about my story, I took a 6-month backpacking trip to South America in 2014, right after I quit my corporate job. And this was a really impactful trip for my life. And Santa Marta was, I think, the second town that we went to in Colombia. And it was really incredible to go back there. 6 years later, I'm a totally different person in a totally different life stage. And it was just fun to go to our favorite restaurants there and check out the site, see how it's changed, all of that goodness. We returned to Panama at the end of February, and we did a weekend trip to Valle de Antón, which is kind of like a weekend getaway for people who live in Panama City. It was a place that we knew we wanted to visit. So that was our last trip that we were able to do in Panama before everything went crazy with the quarantines and the lockdowns and the start of the pandemic on the Western hemisphere of the world. And so we came back from that trip. I think it was like March 8th or something like that. And the first confirmed case happened in Panama, and everything just really heated up from there. Now, my husband and I were supposed to be staying in Panama for many, many more months. And in fact, when I ended up flying back home to Canada, my parents were supposed to be down in Panama. We had an amazing vacation planned. We were going to show them around Panama City. We were going to take some cool boat trips. We were going to do a cool tour of the Panama Canal. My parents got down to the US and they turned around and went right back home. And it was a good thing that they did, because within a day of them going back, the WHO declared a global pandemic. And within a few days of that, I flew back home to Canada. Now, this was a pretty complicated and hard situation, and it was made even harder by the fact that I work for 2 yoga studios. So if you know a little bit about the work that I do, I serve yoga studios outside of the work that I do with yoga teachers. And I work with very, very, very amazing studios, and 2 in particular, one in the US, one in Canada. And both of them had to close their physical doors right around the same time that my parents were supposed to arrive and I was supposed to go on vacation. Thank God I had a vacation planned, because I spent the entire week that I was supposed to be off getting my stuff packed and getting myself back to Canada, while also helping 2 studios take their businesses online. So it was complete chaos, absolutely utter chaos. There was a lot of stress with getting from Panama back to Canada. And then, of course, when I arrived back in Canada, I had to do the 2-week mandatory quarantine, and everything was closed. Most people were in their homes anyways. It was very stressful worrying about getting sick. Meanwhile, I was working like a crazy person. So March was chaos. We all know that. Thankfully, I never got sick. Nobody in my family got sick, and everything worked really well with the studios. They are both still open, they are both still thriving, and they are both doing a hybrid of online and in-person classes. As we fast forward through the months, I think we all know that those spring months were a bit of chaos. For me, they were pretty crazy because I came home to my car being at my in-laws' house, half my stuff being at my parents', and half my stuff being at my husband's parents'. And so after our 2-week quarantine, my husband and I rented a car and drove to his parents' place in British Columbia, where we picked up our vehicle, the rest of our stuff, and started making our plans for getting our own place. So after about 6 weeks of staying with our parents, which, may I note, is the most family time we've had since we both lived at home, which was many, many, many years ago. It was amazing, though, let me say. One of the gifts of 2020 has definitely been family time. Anyways, we found our own place and we moved into our little mountain home of Canmore, Alberta. And by this point, it's May. Things are starting to become a little bit more normal in terms of studio life. Now, something else that is worth mentioning is that with the podcast, I had a whole different content calendar planned for you guys between mid-March and basically through till July or August. So all of my podcast episodes for April and May were already set in stone, basically ready to go. And I looked at the things that we were going to be learning about, and it just didn't make sense. So on top of everything else I've just mentioned, I also scratched most of my content calendar, did a ton of podcast interviews with people about taking their businesses online, and just basically did a whole 180. So while you guys were all doing a 180 with your business, I was also doing a 180 with my business to make sure that I was serving you as best as possible. Now, as we head into the spring, things began to open up a little bit in Canada. I was able to get a haircut, get some coffee from some of my favorite cafes in Canmore. I was able to see a couple of friends, see a few more people in my family, and that type of thing. In mid-June, the yoga studio that I work with in Canada got notice that they were able to officially reopen. And after an evening of really intense measurements, we were able to figure out how to open the studio in a safe way. So after months of just trying to figure out how to live stream classes, getting the teachers and the students figured out with how to do everything online, we got permission to open up again, which was amazing. And we figured out that whole process. So that was another, kind of twist to add to the situation. My husband and I also went on a little local trip in Alberta. We went for a visit to Jasper, Alberta in Jasper National Park. And that was the first time that we'd done any traveling since we had taken that little trip to Baie-d'Anthon at the beginning of March. So between early March and the middle of June, we basically went nowhere. We stayed with our families, we moved into our new place, and that was all we did. And of course, that is fine. It is absolutely okay. But if you know me, you know I love to travel, and that was a long time to go without travel. So there was a lot of good learning experiences within that and some good deep work that happened. As we continue into the summer, things in Canada were going pretty well. We were able to do a couple more trips to British Columbia. We went to places like Nelson and visited my in-laws a couple times in the Okanagan. We were able to see more friends, have more get-togethers, catch up with family, do some outdoor barbecues and that type of thing, which really gave me life. On top of that, we were able to do lots of hiking and just do all the outdoor things. I really, really love being from Canada, and I love spending summers in Canada. So at this point, it was pretty great to be back home. The weather was amazing, and I really felt like I was kind of like a flower that was blooming, with everything that I was doing. Things with work continued to be quite busy between both studios, and at the end of August, the studio that I work with in the US was making plans for shifting software, doing some updates, taking over a second studio, and opening their physical doors back up again. So I took everything that I learned from the June opening and applied that to the second studio in September, and they've been doing great ever since. As we head into the fall, I was able to start making a couple more plans for some travels, and just seeing things open back up again was really invigorating for me. So my husband and I took a trip to Vancouver to see some friends, and then at the end of October, we actually made our way down to Mexico. So I'm currently recording this from Puerto Vallarta, Mexico, in Jalisco, where I am happy and healthy and nice and warm. So although I got to experience all 4 seasons in Canada this year, which was probably not my top choice, I'm really, really grateful that I had, those 7 months at home where I was safe and I was healthy and I got to spend so much time with family and friends. And so I will be down in Mexico for the rest of 2020. I'll be closing out the year here, and I'm excited for another quiet holiday time in Mexico. If you've listened for a while, you've probably heard a couple of these year in reviews being done from, various countries around the world. And Mexico is one that I've spent a number of holiday seasons in, and it's one of my favorite places to spend the holidays. My husband and I always just have quiet, cozy Christmases and quiet, cozy New Year's. And honestly, I'm really excited to be able to be spending this holiday season outside of Canada, away from winter, somewhere where I feel very comfortable, safe, and at home. And it feels like I'm able to kind of wrap this year up in a way that I wasn't totally sure that I was going to be able to. So this year did not take me to many of the places I had expected it to, but it did give me a lot of eye-opening experiences, a lot of challenges that I didn't expect. And overall, I think it's been a relatively okay year considering all the craziness that happened. And so that wraps up everywhere that I've been. I talked a little bit about different things that I did, but a couple others that I want to add to the list is early on before the pandemic, my husband and I launched a podcast network called Wanderbarn, which you can check out at wanderbarn.com. We launched it with all the podcasts that we do together, including this one, as well as we brought on a couple new podcasts to the network, which was really amazing. And we've loved loved seeing them grow and thrive. I also launched a new podcast called Matcha Mornings that I release every second Tuesday, which you can find at wanderbarn.com. And that has been a really fun project for me. And it's on yoga, holistic health, hormones, and it allows me to have these conversations with people about the more holistic side of life and yoga. And I really love these conversations because this is one of the reasons I became a yoga teacher, is because I'm passionate about health and wellness. And so often on MBM, I want to dive into those things. And then I remind myself that you guys are here for the business tips and tricks. So if you want those more holistic conversations, head on over to Wander Barn and check out Matcha Mornings, or find Matcha Mornings on any podcast provider. We've put out about 25 episodes, I think, at this point, and it's been really fun. So it'll be wrapping up for the year around the same time that this episode is going live, and we'll be back next year with some more episodes. So that has been a really fun project that I worked on. Similarly, another couple projects that I worked on, and some of my biggest achievements this year, are launching MBM Behind the Scenes, which is the exclusive Patreon subscription with content that is coming out every single week for the Patreon supporters. And this is a community for yoga entrepreneurs and studio owners. So for those of you who want to take your yoga business to the next level, really create a thriving and sustainable business, this is your place. This is your membership. It's $12 a month. It's super, super, super affordable. You get tons of bonus content, and we go deep on everything having to do with the business of yoga. So I was really happy to launch that. And if you want to check that out, you can head on over to patreon.com/MBM yoga. Another thing that I'm celebrating from this year is that I taught in a teacher training for the first time ever. I taught the business of yoga for their advanced 300-hour teacher training. And then just this fall and into the winter, I have been teaching their business of yoga segment for their 240-hour program. And I'm really, really excited to be continuing to teach with them into 2021. And I love to work with yoga teachers while they're in training, because so much of what we talk about on the podcast, I get to cover with them in training, so that they leave their trainings feeling ready to get teaching jobs, start their careers as yoga teachers, and really dive into creating their own businesses. Another thing that I want to talk about is how my business grew and changed. And this is kind of an interesting concept, because my business was entirely remote pre-pandemic. So the idea of working from home, the idea of working from the same space as my partner, the idea of doing everything via Zoom was already something that I've been doing. Honestly, I've been doing that since 2015. So this whole work from home concept wasn't new to me. What was new to me was working from home and not being able to go to the gym or go to the yoga studio or see my friends outside work. And so I found that one of my big things that I had to work on this year was my boundary setting with my work. So a lot of boundaries went into the work that I do. I really, really worked on my morning routine, my shutdown routine, the hours that I work during a day, and how I utilize them. Because another thing that shifted is that the studio work that I do became a little bit more hands-on than it was before, and in a way that it wasn't prior to the pandemic. And this is the nature of a business shifting 180 degrees. You have to be able to adapt to that and change. And so although I didn't have to do a lot of adapting within my business with MBM, other than looking at the content that I was putting out there and making sure that it was relevant to, the current climate and the situation, I did have to adapt my schedule and my work in a lot of ways. And one thing I found and learned was that a lot of my work boundaries were really based around having these weekend trips and having a social life outside of work and doing things like going to the gym or going to yoga and then getting dinner after. And so all of a sudden, when I was doing everything from home and I didn't have a lot of social opportunities, it was hard to close work down. And there was a lot of work to be done during the heat of this pandemic. And I hit burnout during this year. I hit burnout probably in the summer because it was warm outside. I wanted to be hiking. My to-do list was endless. And that wasn't a super, super thriving time for me. And from what I've heard from yoga teachers, a lot of other people experience this too. And so a lot of us had to put in boundaries and self-care routines in our businesses because we all of a sudden were doing everything from our laptops in a capacity that we weren't doing before. So that was a big change for me. And I feel pretty proud of the work that I've done with the studios that I work with over the last 8 months, really even the entire year, but mostly since the pandemic started, because a lot of studios have closed their doors, and it's really scary to watch small businesses, and especially small businesses that you love, go through this really hard time and feel like you are partially responsible for that. And I know that so many people listening really felt that on a personal and financial level. And for those of you who have gone through the really hard work of keeping your small business open, I really, really applaud you and bow down to you, because it was not easy. It still is not easy. And I think that there's times where it felt like it might have been easier to just give up and just stop, because who knows what's going to happen. And I think for those of you who have pushed through and just kept offering classes and kept serving your students, you're doing the work. You're doing the hard work that 2020 has asked us of. Another big change that happened in my business is I actually stopped doing a lot of my own yoga teaching. So prior to this year, I was running a weekly YouTube channel. I was doing some online privates. And then when I was home in Canmore, I was also teaching in person. And over the last year, I've actually only recorded a very small amount of videos, and I only taught 2 in-person classes. And this has felt really aligned for me over the last year. I was doing a lot of work with the podcast and the work that I do with yoga teachers and yoga studios, and that felt like the work that I wanted to be doing throughout 2020. And so I just put a little pause on teaching. So I don't know how long that pause will last, but for now, that is what we're doing, and that is what we're rolling with, and that is feeling good. Friends, we're going to take a little break from the podcast to hear from Offering Tree, and then we'll be back to talk about more highlights, lowlights, and all things 2020. I am so excited to welcome back Offering Tree as our sponsor. You've heard me talk about them in the past, and many of you are already among their growing community of happy Offering Tree users. With everything that goes into running your yoga business, Offering Tree created a single platform that can solve all your marketing and time management headaches. With a single account, you can create a website in minutes, set up a newsletter, create a blog, schedule classes, and take payment. The great part is that all of Offering Tree's features work seamlessly together, so you don't need to pay for and manage 5 different services. Instead, you get it all in one easy, affordable package. And now, the big news. Offering Tree makes it easy for you to manage memberships, annual, semi-annual, tiered offerings. Regardless of types of memberships you offer, you can create them in Offering Tree with the ease of use Offering Tree is becoming famous for. This amazing platform was built by yogis, so you know they get it. Offering Tree also provides helpful tutorials and webinars to keep you growing as a teacher. It's part of their mission as a public benefit corporation. I love their product and their company. They're providing special pricing for Mbm listeners. So if you want to spend more time teaching and less time managing your digital presence, then check them out at offeringtree.com/MBOM. Again, that's offeringtree.com/MBOM. All right, now back to the episode. All right, everyone, we are back and we are diving into my podcasting highlights from 2020. So 2020 was a pretty good year in terms of podcasting. Despite the fact that we went through a global crisis, I did not miss a beat with the podcast over the last year. And we kicked off the year hearing from Christine Jagaberry all about yoga for scoliosis. And then we did a lot of cool episodes. Some of my favorites were diving deep into the money of yoga with Chioma Njoku. She is one of my favorite money experts and just one of my all-time favorite guests on the podcast. In February, we did a very timely episode with Nikki Nab-Levy about how to run a successful online business. She talked all about launching and all of that good stuff. And at this point, I had no idea how much we would need that episode. I also did a really fun and what I think is a pretty good solo episode called From Chaos to Clarity, Setting Up a Better Workflow in Your Business in the middle of February. And this was a great episode because we got to dive into something that I love, which is organization and productivity in our businesses. And this is something we're going to be talking a bit more about in 2021. So stay tuned for that. In March, I did an episode with my good friend Megan Farrell from Balance by Megan on social media. And then we also did a couple of really great episodes on email copywriting and branding with Tyler McCoon and Christine Lacoyo. In mid-March, there was an awesome bonus episode on Ayurveda 101 with my dear friend Kim Fenton, and that was an episode from Matcha Mornings. You got a little taste of what that podcast was all about. Thankfully, in my backlog of episodes, I had actually interviewed PJ Tai, who is the founder of Uscreen, all about taking your business online with videos and memberships. So that came out right in the heat of the pandemic as I was trying to get home and trying to do all the things. Fortunately, I was able to have Corey Sterling from Conscious Counsel on the podcast, and he talked all about the legal side of taking your business online. And then as we headed into April, I had my dear friend Amanda McKinney back on the podcast to talk about 5 steps of marketing your online offerings. I talked to the amazing Emily Sussel on the business of private yoga, both in person and online. I also had my dear friend Veronica Tai on the podcast to talk all about mindset during COVID-19. And then I was also able to talk to Barry Risman all about building an online community. And this was so good for this time. This was everything that we needed, was to talk about everything online business as everyone shifted to the online world. As we headed into the month of May, I talked about building your email list, insurance for yoga teachers with my friends over at Be Yogi. We had a really great episode on creating a membership with Shannon Crow from Pelvic Health Professionals and, of course, the Connected Yoga Teacher. And creating a membership is a pretty hot topic for 2020 and heading into 2021. This is a really great way to make money in your business and to make recurring money from your ideal target market. So I'm sure that we're going to be talking more and more about that as we head into the new year. We had Jen Corley from We Travel back on the podcast to talk about the future of yoga retreats. And that was we did the episode live in May. It went out in June. And that was kind of the first time that I felt hopeful for what the future has. I also talked with Carol Baxter, who is in Ontario, Canada, about owning a studio and how she was able to pivot during the crisis. I had Kaya Minlin back on the show, and we talked about taking her in-person business online. And this was actually something that she did before 2020 and before we headed into the coronavirus crisis. I also did one of my favorite podcast episodes of this whole year, which was with Julie Majale from the Africa Yoga Project. And we talked all about the impact of the Africa Yoga Project and the impact of yoga on African communities. And after, the whole conversation around Black Lives Matter, this was a really important conversation to have. We talked about the legal side of reopening a yoga studio, and I had Corey Sterling back on the podcast. And then we also dove into how to run successful at-home online yoga businesses and heard from Jess Palmer not once, but twice. We heard her pre-pandemic story about running a yoga studio and then how she pivoted and took her business online. And it was really interesting to hear part 1 of this where things were fine. This was pre-pandemic. And then part 2 of how she was actually able to adjust her business. I did a really amazing episode with Quasi, who talked all about making yoga more accessible to the BIPOC community. And this was a really important conversation to have as well. And I learned so much from this episode, and I'm really inspired to continue having these types of conversations into 2021 and into the foreseeable future, because making yoga accessible to everyone is really, really important to me as a yoga teacher, as a yoga business coach, and as a human in general. We had Mary Oshner on the podcast talking all about growing a following and building an app. And we also discussed the business of Kirtan with Kamini Natarajan. And these were pretty amazing episodes. We also did some cool niching down with Julie McCulpin on pre- and postnatal yoga, Brett Larkin came on the show, which was definitely a highlight. And then one of my favorite topics was with Nick Danu, all about websites. And then if you've been listening over the last couple of weeks, you know we did an episode on the power of the voice. We talked about accounting and bookkeeping, and we talked about my new obsession, which is human design. And I think you can expect more from me in 2021 about human design because I got pretty jazzed up about that. And it's honestly made a massive difference in my life and in my business. So overall, I would say that 2020 was a pretty successful year for the podcast. We covered a lot of different things throughout the year on the show. And I'm grateful for everyone who has listened to all of these episodes or some of these episodes. And I hope that you'll let me know which episodes you like, which ones were your favorites, which topics you want to hear more about. You know, you can always email me at info@mbmyoga.com or DM me on Facebook or Instagram at Mastering the Business of Yoga. I always love to hear from you guys. Now, in terms of the podcast, we didn't see a ton of download growth this year. So I had some big goals about doubling the podcast downloads at the beginning of the year. Now, something that's interesting, and I've talked to my other podcasting friends about this, is that during the at-home period of the global pandemic, almost all podcast hosts experienced a decrease in download numbers. So I think because a lot of people weren't commuting, a lot of people weren't outside, a lot of people weren't in their normal routines, people weren't listening to podcasts as much. And I experienced this as a listener of podcasts. I got behind on a ton of my favorite shows, and it wasn't until gyms opened back up and I was able to start driving and getting out and about a little bit more that I started catching up on shows. So we never really experienced a huge drop in downloads over here, but we didn't see the growth that we were hoping for. So big goals are in store for 2021, and something that you could do to help me with that is that if you enjoy this show, please share it with a yoga teacher or a studio owner in your life who you think could benefit from it. That's one of the best ways that you can help me. So the last part of this podcast episode is going to be diving into some lowlights of the year and what I learned during this crazy year. And this is a section that I always cover, what I learned, but I think the learnings this year probably just top off the other years because it sure has been a year. So some of the biggest lowlights or challenges this year, first and foremost, I lost my grandma to cancer in April. And fortunately, I was able to see her one last time through a distance visit because I did get home in time. But losing her was easily the hardest thing that I went through this year, especially with it being such a challenging year in terms of spending time with friends and family. Not being able to hug my grandpa for so many months was literally one of the hardest things I've ever had to go through. And I know that means I have a lot of privilege in my life, but it was really, really hard. Having to come home in the middle of a crisis was scary and it was stressful, and it's not something I want to repeat anytime soon. On top of that, watching businesses that I love and studios that I love have to close their physical doors and to see some of them not reopen was really, really heartbreaking. And I think that a lot of us have similar experiences from this year and similar emotions of there was a lot of sadness and heartbreak that came with this year just from losing things and not really expecting that. I don't know about you, but when I thought of the year 2020, I just thought this year has this magical ring to it. We're entering a new decade. It is going to be an amazing year. And it was not the year that I was expecting. Of course, having to cancel plans and cancel trips was something that was challenging. Many, many, many trips and plans got canceled. One of my best friends had to postpone her wedding. We canceled a really cool family trip to Europe. And all of that was not stuff that I'm super stoked about. But some of the biggest learnings I had this year really outweigh that. And one of those was seeing the silver linings in all things. So being able to look back on the last 8 months and see the silver linings of this experience has been one of the greatest gifts this year has given me. And one of those silver linings was the gift of time with my family. I got to spend 3 weeks staying with my parents and 3 weeks staying with my husband's parents, plus a couple more weeks staying with my in-laws later in the summer and into the fall. And this was a lot of family time. This is more time than we've spent with our parents and my in-laws than we have in the last couple of years, because we're always on the go. And because we didn't have a lot of trips planned, we did a lot of barbecues and we did a lot of distanced hangouts. And we went to my parents' lake house for a long weekend. And of all the trips that I regret that didn't happen, I'm also so grateful for the cozy time at home spent with my closest loved ones. And being forced to have a little bubble and to choose who you spend your time with means that you really get to see who you really love. And guys, I love my family. And that was a pretty amazing thing to get to rediscover and reconnect with this year. Another big, huge learning, which I think a lot of you also learned this year, was how to take businesses online. And specifically for me, this was how to take a yoga studio online. And I learned this basically overnight with a lot of trial and error. And I feel pretty proud of this learning. And I feel confident that if there was a yoga studio that approached me for whatever reason saying, hey, I need to take my business online, I could walk them through step by step how to do it, what equipment to use, how to communicate to their students and their teachers, what not to do, and all that good stuff. So that was a huge learning for me. And I'm really grateful for that learning because I think that it's going to be really beneficial for me in the future. I also really learned a lot about boundaries. Like I mentioned before, boundaries was one of the biggest challenges I had this year. And it was also one of my biggest learnings, learning how to create boundaries within my work and my business without relying and depending on my social commitments, my exercise time, my social time, and my travels was really good for me because I don't really like saying no to people, especially people who depend on me. And it was good for me to exercise no, to make sure I had days off, and to really push myself to my end and to my breaking point so that I could come back and really build in that self-care and those good habits. Other thing that I really learned this year, took away from this year, was how much it fills my bucket to be in person with people. I am a natural extrovert. I'm like an introverted extrovert. I love alone time. I love quiet nights in, but I'm fully a natural extrovert in that I vibe off other people's energy. And being alone or just with my partner for many months without a lot of social interaction really showed me how much I love to fill my bucket with other people's energy. And this wasn't so much the learning of I should spend more time alone or anything like that. I'm totally comfortable alone. That's big work that I did in my 20s. But I just realized how much I actually really do love to be around people. Being back in yoga studios in person, breathing in person was really amazing. Hugging friends for the first time after many months of not doing that really, really filled up my bucket. And I really learned a lot about myself through this journey of this year. Through this global crisis, I learned a lot about myself, my beliefs, the way I take care of myself, the way I think about the world. And I'm grateful for those learnings. And I truly hope that you have had those experiences as well. Despite everything that has happened this year, I feel like this year has taken a lot from us. It's just like take. I have really been uncovering the gifts that I've been given this year, and I would really encourage you to do the same. So we're coming to the end of this episode, and I wanted to give you a couple of prompts if you wanted to do your own year in review. So a couple things that I love to ask myself or to look at are where I've been and what I did. I like to look at my biggest achievements of the year. I like to look at how my business grew and changed. For me, I look at podcasting highlights, but you could look at, class highlights or something that's more relevant to your business. And then I love to look at challenges, lowlights, and what I learned, because this is where we kind of look at what wasn't so great and kind of switch our perspective on it a little bit. And I really, truly love that. So we are wrapping up this episode. We are also wrapping up this year. Mbm will be on a podcast break until January, so we will be offline for the next couple of weeks. I am very excited to be taking some time for myself away from my business so that I can come back next year feeling excited and energized and reinvigorated for all the right content that you are going to listen to. I assure you, we are going to have an awesome year in 2021 with all the learnings that we're going to be talking about on MBM. There is lots coming down the pipeline, and I cannot wait to share it with you. Before we finish up this episode of the show, I wanted to remind you about MBM behind the scenes. I talked about it as something that I'm really proud of from this year, and we have a really great bonus episode going out today. This is a full-length bonus episode with a yoga teacher named Kristen Zucchero, and she is talking about all of her biggest learnings as a new yoga teacher. So she is talking from the lens of somebody who just started. She's talking about all the things that she's learned, all of her top takeaways, and all of her business lessons. Now, I know many of you are thinking, what can be gleaned from a new yoga teacher? I've been teaching for years, but I think there's actually a lot that can be learned from people who are new into this industry because they bring this really interesting, fresh perspective. So I would love for you to go check out this episode. You can get access to it at patreon.com/MBM. I would love to hear what you think about it. Make sure you send me a message and let me know. I also want to say a huge thank you to our sponsor, Offering Tree. They are part of the reason that we're able to continue producing this podcast. So I would love for you to head on over to offeringtree.com/MBM to get an exclusive discount. You can start teaching more and managing less using their software. Once again, that's offeringtree.com/MBM. Happy holidays, happy new year, and I will see you in 2021. Bye for now. Thank you so much for tuning in for this episode of the podcast. To find links, notes, resources, and everything mentioned in today and all episodes of the show, you can head on over to mbmyoga.com. You can find the podcast and myself on Facebook and social media at Mastering the Business of Yoga. And I would love for you to join the private Facebook community, Yoga Business Badasses. If you have any questions, comments, or feedback, please make sure you reach out to me at info@mbmyoga.com. And last of all, if you enjoyed this episode of the show, please make sure you hit subscribe and leave a review for the podcast. It would mean the world. Thanks so much for listening, and I'll see you next week. Namaste.